This video continues our study of comprehension and how we can facilitate students' reading comprehension. And in this recording, we're going to talk about text structures. So if you haven't heard the term text structure before, you might be wondering what that is. It's a fancy term to mean the way that writers organize information. And there are differences between narrative text structures and informational text structures. And we're going to talk about the difference between those two very shortly. But first, there are some reasons why you should consider teaching text structures in order to develop your students' comprehension. When students are knowledgeable about different text structures, it helps them understand how a text is organized, and it also helps them understand the relationship between the ideas and the events that are noted in the text, and in turn, having these two understandings can help students better comprehend what they read. I know that when I preview a text and I realize what sort of a text structure is used by the author, it helps me anticipate what the author is going to say and how the text is going to be laid out, which facilitates my understanding of it. So I highly recommend that you teach text structures to your students. So narrative text structure refers to the way that narrative text is organized. And when we talk about narrative text, we're talking about stories. And typically in a story, the author starts off by introducing us to characters and the problems they have. Then the action begins building until it reaches a turning point or a climax. And then the action is resolved. We have falling action and then a resolution. As an example, if you are familiar with the book Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, we're introduced to the characters and their problems. In the very beginning, we have this boy Max, and he dons a wolf suit and he frightens his mother, and she sends him to bed without dinner. So, that happens, and then Max he actually falls asleep and visits the land of the wild things, and he tames the wild things, and that's the rising action of the story. And while the wild things worship him as their king, Max realizes he's really quite homesick. So that's really the turning point of the story, is when he decides to go home. So he leaves the wild things and he travels in his dreams back to home, and the story is resolved when Max finds that he has his dinner waiting for him in his bedroom. So that's a typical narrative text structure that you find when you read narrative or works of fiction. And typically with narratives, you have particular elements that we call story elements that you can teach students to look for. For example, all stories are going to have characters. They're going to have a setting. They're also going to have a problem, or sometimes multiple problems that are faced by the characters. And we also have a solution to the problem. So these are different elements of a narrative text structure. On the other hand, when we talk about informational books or expository text, which are works of nonfiction, so for example, books about different animals, or books about famous people, or books that describe an event in history, those types of books have very different text structures. They do not follow the narrative text structure that we just talked about here. In fact, expository texts include several different types of text structures that I'm going to talk about individually next. So problem solution is one type of expository text structure, and with this text structure, the author sets up a problem and offers solutions to that problem. And we can usually identify a problem solution text structure by viewing words such as because, cause, since, as a result, so, and therefore. When we see those words in a text, that usually lets us know that the author is using the problem solution text structure. For example, African American citizens of Montgomery were sick of unfair treatment on the buses. That's the problem. Therefore, leaders in African American churches and the NAACP developed a plan to boycott the buses until all people received fair and equitable treatment. So that's the solution. And you can see that I signaled to you that I was using the problem solution text structure by my use of the word therefore at the very beginning of the second sentence. And when we teach students about different text structures, we can visually represent the information in expository text by having them map the information out on a graphic organizer. And what I have shown here on this slide is an example of a graphic organizer that you could use to map information that appears in a text that's written in that problem solution text structure. So on the left you would write the problem that people faced, and then on the right hand side you could write the different solutions to the problem. So it's a way of visually representing how the information is presented in a text. And graphic organizers like these research has shown that these are very useful for facilitating students' comprehension. Cause-effect is another type of text structure, and as you can imagine from the name, the author describes an event and the causes of that particular event, and we can identify this text structure by looking for words like therefore, so, this leads to, because of, as a result of, since, cause, and effect. And sometimes, with cause and effect, you see signal words that are the same as problem solution. So you do have to read the text carefully in order to determine whether you're looking at a text that's written in the problem solution text structure or whether the text is written in the cause-effect text structure. Here's an example. The Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow Marian Anderson to perform at Constitution Hall. Because of this, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, a fierce opponent of racial inequality, resigned from the DAR. So the cause is that the DAR did not let Marian Anderson, who was a very famous African-American singer, perform at the Constitution Hall, and the effect is that Eleanor Roosevelt thought that was wrong, so she resigned from the DAR. So we can see this strong relationship there between cause and effect. And I use the signal term because of to signal the relationship between these two events. And this is a graphic organizer that you can use for teaching cause and effect, or that you can use for having students visually represent a text that is written in the cause and effect text structure. So as you can see on the left, you list the cause, and on the right you list the effect, and you have spaces for multiple causes and effects if you need them. Chronological text structure is sometimes also called the temporal or sequential text structure. We're talking about the same thing, so those terms are pretty interchangeable. And with chronological text structure, an author is explaining a sequence of events in the order in which they occur. And signal words include things like first, second, third, next, then, last, and so on. And this text structure is fairly easy to identify. And as you can imagine, we often see this text structure if we're reading about an event in history. Oftentimes authors will explain a sequence of events, or sometimes when we're reading about science and we're learning about a process like how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, we'll often see the chronological text structure. In my example here on this slide, this is just a made-up paragraph about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But as you can see, I've highlighted all of the signal words in blue, and those signal words would help you identify, okay, this is, giving me a step-by-step account. This is a chronological step, or a chronological order of events. And there are several different types of graphic organizers that you can use for visually representing information that's conveyed using the chronological text structure. The one you see on the left called chronological order just has a list of events. It lets you give some details about the event and the date on which it occurred. I think that one would be particularly useful if you were reading, say, a book that described events in history. Whereas the one on the right is a little bit more generic and just it depicts how things occur step by step, and you can fill in the bubbles with the different events that are described in the text. And then we have the compare-contrast text structure. And with this text structure, the author describes the similarities and differences between people, animals, objects, concepts, or events. And some of the signal words that we see in this text structure include things like also, likewise, as well as, similar to, different from, in contrast, however, yet, and so forth. And as an example here, dogs and wolves both have sharp eyesight and a keen sense of smell. They are also both social animals. Yet wolves live in the wild while dogs are domesticated and live with people. So all of those signal words that I've highlighted in blue help you see that I'm describing how dogs and wolves are similar and also how they are different. And those signal words give me clues that this is indeed a compare-contrast text structure. And you are probably very familiar with the graphic organizer on the left called a Venn diagram. I think this is very commonly used in school settings. And with a Venn diagram, just in case you're not familiar with it, we have these two circles placed together, and where the circles meet, we list what the two concepts or people or animals have in common. And then in the rest of the graphic organizer, we list the ways in which they are different. But the problem with a graphic organizer is, a Venn diagram graphic organizer is that it doesn't really provide a lot of space for students to write, especially when you're making comparisons between two things. So another way that you can have students visually represent information conveyed in a compare-contrast text structure is to have students utilize what's called a top hat graphic organizer, and that's what you see on the right side of the slide. And a top hat graphic organizer is named that way because it resembles a top hat. So everything that is different between the two concepts, in this case a frog and a toad, would be listed vertically in the columns, and then everything that frogs and toads have in common would be listed horizontally at the bottom, which would be the brim of the top hat. And our last type of expository text structure is description. And with description, the author simply describes characteristics of a person, place, animal, and so forth. And with description, the author doesn't use any particular signal words. And I have an example here. Cats make delightful pets. They will sit in your lap and keep you warm when you are cold. They like to play and will chase toy mice and pieces of string. So I'm not comparing anything, I'm not contrasting anything, I'm not setting up a problem and explaining how it's solved. I'm simply describing why cats make delightful pets. And when we teach students about descriptive text structures, we can often use something called a concept web, like you see on the slide, to visually represent that information. So the main topic is usually placed in the center bubble, and supporting details or supporting information is placed on the bubbles that are radiating from the center bubble. So one thing that's important to know is that authors of expository text often use multiple text structures within sometimes even within a given section of the text. For example, if you're reading a textbook, you can often identify examples of several different text structures. So it's important that we teach students how to identify those. However, sometimes authors of expository text will just stick to one type of text structure. For example, if you are reading a history textbook, a lot of the time you're going to see that chronological text structure as really the dominant text structure. So it's just important to keep in mind that text structures can occur on a macro level, meaning that the text as a whole follows a particular structure, but sometimes we also see text structures operating on the micro level, meaning, within a particular section of a text, we might see multiple types of text structures. I remember reading an article in Time for Kids about puffins and how they are in danger, and within the short article written for children, I was able to identify 3 or 4 different types of text structures. So, they can certainly the kind of text structures you see in informational or expository text can be very varied. So in terms of how you teach text structures to students, usually with your first lesson, you want to model to students how you can visually represent a text structure using a graphic organizer like some of the ones I've shown you in this video recording. So you want to model that for students. So as the teacher, what I would do is I would read the text in front of the students and I would do a think aloud, and I would identify those signal words, and I would think aloud and reason through how I am identifying the text structure that's being given in the text. Then I would show students how to map that information from the text onto the graphic organizer. And of course you want to do this so the whole class can see what's going on. So, you'd want to use a smartboard or an overhead projector, depending on what kind of technology your classroom has. In your second and third lessons, you would want to continue modeling this for students, but you would ask the students for their input, so you would have them contribute to it. And then in subsequent lessons, if you feel your students are ready, you could have students try to map the information from the text onto graphic organizers on their own. But of course, it really, when you release that responsibility to students, really depends on their level of readiness. And as the teacher, you're the one in the best position to judge when you can release that responsibility to the students. So you're going to be watching another video about text structures that explains how you can identify text structures, and it also goes into some detail using other examples of different text structures. So please make sure you watch that to deepen your understanding of text structures. I know that with this video I'm just really giving you a quick overview of what they are, but hopefully this is helpful and you gain some additional information about text structures by watching the next video.